If I was a fly on the wall, the decisions being made to create these standards that are similar to the ones before, what would that have been like?
The new dress and grooming standards, or we talked about honor code, or we talked about the ecclesiastical conditions of employment. Most of the decisions that have been made are intended to do one of two things.
The new honor code, any insight, any perspective that would be helpful to help create community, how it's connected to that?
Yeah. Well, I mean, it certainly starts with the idea that it's principle-based.
Yeah.
That idea of principle-based. By the way, principle-based is not easy.
It's not easy.
Right? I mean, exactly. Right? It's kind of like when For the Strength of Youth came out, and there were discussions about, so what you're saying is there's no restriction against me doing this.
Yeah.
And I think that these changes, we knew that there was going to be some period of time where we were going to have to learn our way through this.
Okay.
So that sense of community, by it being principle based, I think is really an important one, because what it leads to is conversations.
Yeah.
And I think too often when it's checklist, or when it's purely this or that, we don't take the time to have those conversations. And there have been some really amazing conversations had on campus, not just between faculty and students, but student to student. And I've loved that, and that really engenders a sense of belonging, a sense of community. And I think when we talk about covenants, that binding ourselves to the Savior really gives us the responsibility to look out for our brother.
Can you take me to, like, if I was a fly on the wall, the decisions being made to create these standards that are similar to the ones before, what would that have been like?
I'll just take you back through one that was a little while ago, ecclesiastical employment standard, which really boiled down to the same as the temple recommend questions. If I were to take a sample of people before those, that change was made on campus, most of the faculty, like super majority of the faculty, thought that was already the conditions. Like they kind of assumed that was the case.
No, that's true. Yeah.
And so we kind of were operating as if those were the conditions all along. And what it really did boil down to was questions of the belief, the first four questions in the temple recommend questions. Most of the decisions that have been made, kind of high-level decisions that are made on campus, so many of them are intended to do one of two things. Those things are intended to drive home this idea that we are all children of God. And that's a relative position of strength for us as a campus community, in part because it should shape how we treat one another. Like it is the fundamental idea that we ought to be better at, because we understand those unique identities, that we know how to treat one another. Now, we don't always execute on that perfectly. We still have work to do, but that is a critical part of a lot of discussions at a high level we've had. The second one, candidly, I love this, and this is sometimes missed when we talk about a new standard for ecclesiastical standard for employment at BYU, or the new honor code and the questions that are going to be asked of students and from their ecclesiastical leaders in those interviews. The sole driver behind those questions, the sole driver, is to point our students to the temple. Like, it's a transformative place. The things that happen there are beautiful. I often will talk to students. They're like, well, look, I don't have a current temple recommend, or I haven't been endowed. How that doesn't apply to me. So, and I've even had this conversation with students who aren't members of the church. And here's the deal. I actually think that there's even some power that comes from even a stroll around the temple grounds. I think proximity to the temple has some power. And so I hope that when we get into some of the discussions, and some of that there are discussions around, well, were they trying to do this, or were they trying to do this? Truth is, trying to understand who you really are and trying to point you to the temple drove 95% of what we were trying to address when we talk about the new dress and grooming standards, or we talked about honor code, or we talked about the ecclesiastical conditions of employment. It was trying to get people pointed to the temple. Boy, we talked about, and you talk about hearing that so recently from those we sustain as prophets, seers, and revelators, and you see why that emphasis is so strong. Those are incredibly unifying things. Those are incredibly welcoming, kind of belonging things. And the hope is that the campus feels that way. I hear anecdotes from students, emails, unsolicited emails from students who talk about having gone on this temple trip or went and walked around the temple with somebody. And this was maybe a roommate when they were quarreling, or it's just small things.
Yeah.
But they talk about the difference that it made. And I hope that in all of the conversations about details of some of these things, we don't lose sight of those two things.